In this video, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the properties of sensory receptors in the body. All right. Now, remember we said that sensory receptors are parts of the peripheral nervous system that are designed to detect stimuli, changes in our homeostatic environment. Okay. And these three main properties of receptors are important for you guys to understand in terms of just understanding their overall function. Okay. And sensory receptors are what we call transducers. Transduction is a property, okay? When we're talking about transduction, we're talking about basically taking one form of energy and converting it into another. Okay, so that's what receptors do, okay? And remember, receptors are pretty specific to the stimuli they're designed to detect, okay? So, for example, there are mechanoreceptors in the body. They're designed to detect physical changes of the body, like pressing on the skin. Okay, so basically what happens is you put pressure on that receptor and you're going to alter the membrane permeability of that receptor. And so that physical energy that was applied to that receptor is now going to turn into an action potential. That's basically what receptors do. They take some of their form of energy and convert that into an electrochemical response, which you know of as the action potential. Okay, photoreceptors in the eye take electromagnetic radiation, basically, sunlight, okay, and, that radiation from, that light radiation hits those receptors, hits the photosensitive pigments in those receptors, and then we'll go through a process, and then we'll convert that into an action potential, a nervous impulse. All right, if there's a change in your chemistry, there are chemoreceptors that will detect that change and convert that into an action potential and let your brain know. Okay, there are pressure receptors in major arteries of your body called baroreceptors. Okay, and then again, a change in blood pressure will stimulate those receptors to generate action potentials and will carry out the appropriate response. Okay, so hopefully you're getting the picture with this. Okay, again, transduction is just taking one form of energy and converting it into another. When we're talking specifically about sensory receptors, we're taking a form of energy and converting it into an action potential, a nervous impulse. Okay, so we can let the brain, the central nervous system, know that there is a stimulus disrupting our physiology, disrupting our homeostasis. Okay, so transduction, sensory receptors are transducers. Okay, and these are like any other type of excitable tissue or excitable cell in the body. Sensory receptors have a receptor potential. Okay, like a membrane potential. All right, and if we do something to basically disrupt that membrane potential, then those receptors are going to start to fire. Remember, when we talked about the action potential, we drew this graph. We said that a resting nerve, negative 70 millivolts. There's, a threshold of negative 55, 0, yada, yada. Okay, and we said that, if we excite a neuron enough, if we get a big enough gradient potential, then we'll generate an action potential. Okay, that's what we're talking about here. Okay, and remember that there are always little changes that are going on in our environment all the time. Okay, but if the stimulus is strong enough, all right, if the stimulus is strong enough to alter the permeability of that sensory receptor, then that receptor is going to start generating action potentials to the brain. Okay, and then so then as a result, the brain is going to get information saying, oh, well, there's a stimulus, we have to do something about it. Okay, and there are basically four major types of energy, or four major ways that we alter the membrane permeability or the excitability of these sensory receptors. One is through mechanical force. Okay, there are receptors in the body that are sensitive to physical, literal physical mechanical changes. So if there is pressure applied to when you hear mechanical, think pressure. Okay, so when there's a pressure applied to that sensory receptor, because remember, these sensory receptors are just neurons, okay, so these are a little more specialized neurons, all right? So again, we talked about with the action potential, if you apply a strong enough stimulus to that, you're going to open enough sodium gates Sodium is going to diffuse in. The inside is going to become more positive, and if enough sodium comes in, and if the inside becomes positive enough, you'll generate an action potential. Okay, and with mechanoreceptors, if we apply enough physical force to that receptor, then enough physical force to let enough sodium in, then we'll generate an action potential. Okay, chemical. All right, there's chemical stimulation of the body, or stimulation of receptors. So if we introduce a chemical to a sensory neuron that makes sodium gates open, then the chemoreceptor is going to send action potentials to the brain. Okay, if we change the temperature of the membrane, okay, that's going to change the receptor potential, if it's enough to the point where we're going to send impulses to the brain. Okay, and then electromagnetic radiation, this is more specific to or light receptors in the eye. Okay, so these are really the main types of stimuli that the body's going to run into that we're going to be detecting, that the sensory stimuli that we need to be aware of. Okay, and I'll go a little more in depth into the modality and classification of receptors. Okay, but realistically, when you're thinking about a certain kind of receptor, again, think that these are the four main stimuli that irritate receptor potential. Okay, and then we get more specific into, deep pressure or, light pressure. Which chemicals are we talking about here that we're sensitive to? Is this a minor change in temperature or is it an extreme change in temperature? Okay. And also something else to keep in mind is that the the rate of action potentials is directly proportional to the intensity of the stimulus. Okay, this is the one nice thing about sensory receptors of the body in general, is that they respond proportionally to how intense the stimulus is. Okay, so basically, again, this is going to be small, but if I graph this out, all right. Excuse me, when we say this is stimulus strength, okay, we say that's stimulus strength, and then we say this is amplitude. Okay, if we apply a very strong stimulus, okay, to the sensory receptor, all right, you're going to see a pretty dramatic increase in the rate of action potentials. All right, but that's really nice. Okay, that's a convenient feature for us to have because that gives sensory receptors a wide range to work within. Okay, so if there's a weak enough stimulus to make that receptor generate an action potential, great, we're going to let the brain know. Okay, but if the stimulus strength gets stronger and stronger, the rate of action potentials are going to get stronger and stronger. Starting to see the picture here? Okay, but the thing is, if we apply a really strong stimulus immediately to a receptor, it's not really, the receptors have a certain point where they're going to basically not be able to, where this amplitude is not going to be able to adapt to the strength. Okay, so keep that in mind. But like I said, this is very convenient for us because this makes receptors very sensitive and gives us a wide range to operate within. Okay. So the more intense the stimulus, the more intense the action potential. It's plain and simple. All right. And another important property about sensory receptors to understand is adaptation. Okay, receptors will adapt to the stimulus. Okay, and again, how the receptor adapts depends on the receptor itself and the modality of the stimulus. Okay. But if you want to break this down into two groups, there are some receptors that adapt very slowly, and there are some receptors that adapt very quickly. All right? So basically, these slow adapting receptors are what we call tonic receptors. Okay? Tonic. So these receptors, being that they adapt slowly, so for example, one common example that people like to use are what are called Golgi tendon organs. Okay, these are basically sensory receptors that are found within tendons of the body. Remember, tendons attach muscles to bone. Okay, and you remember when muscles contract, they shorten, they pull on tendons, which then pulls on bones, so we can create movement. All right, but if there's too much force from that contraction applied to the tendon, then these organs are going to generate action potentials to the brain, and stimulate basically the antagonist muscle groups to contract. The reason why that's important is because, if that muscle is applying too much force to that tendon and we don't do anything to change that, that muscle could rip that tendon apart. Okay, so it's important that we have the ability to monitor, how much force and muscle tension is being applied to a tendon itself. Okay, but these are very slow adapting receptors, meaning they're constantly generating action potentials to the brain. That's why we call them tonic, because they're constantly sending information to the brain. All right, and then an example of a phasic receptor. These are receptors that adapt very, very quickly, meaning, there's a stimulus that irritates that receptor and it starts generating action potentials, but it adapts very, very quickly as well, almost as soon as you stimulate the receptor. Okay? And a very, probably one of the most well-studied examples of this, or receptors in general, are Pacinian corpuscles. Okay? These are basically pressure receptors in the skin. All right, they look something like this. There's kind of a central axon, and then there's a lot of basically tissue wrapped around it. Okay, so what happens when you apply pressure to a Pacinian corpuscle? Okay, all this surrounding tissue is going to eventually compress the membrane of this neuron, this axon. Okay, or neuron. I'm sorry. Okay, and then as a result, once there's pressure applied to this. Okay, that physical pressure is going to alter the shape and of the cell membrane. We're going to open sodium gates, and you're going to generate an action potential. Okay, but almost immediately, this receptor is going to adapt to this. So if you apply pressure to that corpuscle and the pressure doesn't change, it's going to stop sending action potentials after a while. So, like for example, when you put glasses on your face and you forget they're there. All right, and then you run around, you run around looking for your glasses, yelling, swearing, trying to figure out where they're at, and then eventually everyone's pointing at you and laughing, and then you realize that, oh, shoot, these are on my face. Okay. So basically, if we apply pressure to that, so what's going to make this receptor fire again is if we increase the amount of pressure that's already there. Okay, so the more intense. All right, but again, still the more intense the modality, yes, the action potentials are going to go up, but if it doesn't change, again, that receptor is going to adapt quite quickly. Okay, so realistically, these types of receptors are very good at responding mechanical changes, that take place in the environment, but they're not very good at long-term regulation or detection of the environment as well. Okay, so again, these are some basic properties of receptors. Again, you need to just think about. Again, think of them as transducers, converting energy from one form to another. Again, in a situation of us, we're talking about taking some kind of stimulus and converting it into an electrochemical energy and action potential. Okay, and remember that receptors, like any other type of neuron, are excitable tissues. They're excitable cells. Okay, they have a membrane potential that will change. Once the stimulus irritates it enough, once the gradient potential is strong enough. Okay, and I mentioned these 4 major types of stimuli that affect sensory neurons. And again, think about the intensity aspect of this. That receptors generate action potentials in proportion to the intensity of the stimulus, and that receptors adapt. Okay, which is a good thing because these are cells like any other kind of cell. These are this takes work to generate action potentials to the brain, all right? And if these receptors don't adapt, they could potentially become damaged, all right? And the brain doesn't need to sit there and know your glasses are on your face all the time, okay? That's not a life-threatening stimulus by any means, all right? So, basic properties of sensory receptors. In the next video, I want to talk a little bit about classification of the various modalities we use to classify receptors.